So thank you so much for joining us on this fairly overcast and rainy day to talk about something that I hold quite dear, as does Dr. McCarthy. We are in our department working on rolling out a religious studies program at some point in the distant future, hopefully sooner rather than later. We intend to have an AA in religious studies. It may be a long process. So it's a relatively new beginning and a new direction for the department. We already have our world religions courses, and we have Hebrew Bible, and we have New Testament, and we have a whole variety of really interesting courses. But we do kind of want to follow in the footsteps of where the scholarship is at, so we help prepare our students for what they're going to encounter when they transfer. Unfortunately, we have someone from Chico State today who has a really robust department, has done a lot of work in building that department, who has designed certificates for non-majors, which you'll hear about today. So we can see about where we're going to try to be at ARC, how we can help you transfer, how we can help you get to where you're going. So Diana Eck's book is a super important one. It is an entry point into a much larger conversation, right? Diana Eck's book is an entry point into a much larger conversation. So this afternoon we will be hearing about Diana's book, but we'll also be hearing about where the conversation is today in terms of the scholarship, right? So we'll talk about Diana Eck a little bit, but we're also talking about the broader conversation that she ends up starting, right? So this book was written before 9/11, right? And it was already on the radar about how religion impacts culture, impacts the United States. And so the scholarship has gone into, had some new conversations, which is very interesting. So that's what we'll be talking about today in addition to Diana Eck. Essentially, what we'll be hearing about is how do we talk about something that most of us are not that comfortable talking about, right? Which is religion, right? There's a couple of things that most of us are told you don't really bring up in polite society, right? We're not likely to want to go and start conversations about this. But that brings with it a certain, which we'll hear more about, but that brings with it a certain challenge, a certain problem, which is that because we don't talk about it, we end up not having a lot of information about it, or if we do, we have particular types of information about it without having a sense of the nuance and complexity of the very diverse and complex country that we have and the laws that we have about school and about religion, and how this all kind of gets mixed up into one complicated conversation that people would rather just walk away from, right? So as time has gone by, we've definitely started to notice that there are some very concrete problems that arise from not having a little bit of what we're going to hear about today, religious literacy, right? And I'll give you one example of that, and then we'll hear so from Dr. McCarthy. But here on campus, this is an example of religious literacy. Having information about the different religious traditions here on campus at ARC, as well as in Sacramento, in California, and across, of course, our country, right? So we had a student last semester, and this was in the most recent edition of the ARC Current, so you can read about this story there. And a student this was a Muslim student who was doing some prayers, and he was doing them in a field here on campus. We have these lovely fields, right? Kind of far away from anyone, and some students had walked by him, and when they saw this man praying, they become very concerned, and they ended up calling the police and reporting terrorist activity, right? Now, for those of you who don't know, performing prayers 5 times a day is a regular part of Muslim practice, right? Now, the police arrived, they detained the student, and they ended up questioning him for a little over a half an hour about whether or not he was, in fact, committing an act of terrorism by praying, right? And the obvious problem with that, well, there's a lot of obvious problems with that, right? Which is that someone is going about their ordinary life. And because we don't have a lot of information about the beliefs of people who may or may not believe differently than us, then we can become afraid of them, right? Ignorance and fear go hand in hand so frequently. So what ends up happening is that this becomes a problem, right? I've had, and this is just one example from one tradition, but I've had some of my Muslim students will come up to me and say, you know, Professor, I feel like whenever I wear my hijab, I have to hold the door open for the entire class and smile to them so that they know that I'm not going to hurt them, right? And they take that burden on themselves every day, right? So that's a really tough situation to be in, and it's a really complex conversation. But these are examples of why we need to know a little. We need to have a little bit more facts about some of the ideas about our complex world. And the academic study of some of these facts can come out of religious literacy, can come out of religious studies, and the most recent conversations about how do we talk about religion on campus, across campuses across the country, come into this conversation on religious literacy. So that's really what we're here to talk about today, and that's what Diana Eck's book is about. She's saying that, to quote her, right, whether you're religious or whether you're deeply allergic to religion, wherever you stand on that, right, we need to know far more about the religious energies of the world and about our country and community campus than we do right now, right? And so that conversation is one that Diana Eck starts and that we're going to hear about today from Dr. McCarthy, who drove down from Chico just to talk to us. So let's please give her a warm round of applause.
Thank you so much, and thank you for giving me your lunch hour. Is my voice loud enough to carry in the room? We're okay, right? Okay, great. So, true confession, I'm not going to talk about Diana Eck's book. It's a great book. Everybody should read it. It started a conversation that developed very, very quickly following the publication of that book. She called her book A New Religious America. What's the publication year?
2001.
2001, okay. So in 2001, we were living in a new religious America. We are living in a newer religious America now. Not essentially different from the patterns she was charting, but so much faster, the change that she was tracking. So, for instance, she famously cites in there that we are now the most religiously diverse nation in the world, and that we have more, I think one of the popular statistics in there is there are more Buddhists living in the United States than Episcopalians. Well, that's a very different situation from what was true, 50, 100, 200 years ago. So we are a new religious America. And the big reality to come out of that is not only that change in our demographics, who we are religiously as Americans. By the way, the fastest growing sector in religion in the United States, the group that's slice of the pie is growing faster. Anybody know? Fastest? Non-religious people. That's the fastest growing. So we're diversifying in that way too, right? I'll show you some statistics in a minute. So the makeup of our religious identities is changing, and the intensification of our interaction with one another, with those who are religiously different from us, is now a daily reality. For better and worse, right? In unfortunate ways, like the encounter of the Muslim student trying to observe his daily prayer and being accused of being a terrorist, but in very positive ways of enriching one another's understanding of the world and culture and experience. But it's a reality of interconnectedness that we didn't have to reckon with in the past. So I want to make a case to you today that multi-religious literacy, and I tack multi on there because if you only are literate in one religion, you ain't religiously literate. Not in this situation. So multi-religious literacy as a critical competency. And I appreciate those opening remarks about how this is true for, this is a critical competency not just for religious folks, but also for non-religious folks, because guess what? You live in a pretty religious society. And if you want to be successful in that world, you don't have to accept what all those other folks believe, but it would be helpful if you knew something about it and understood it a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to try to convince you that this is a critical competency, and then I'm going to try to sell you on the Chico State program where you can develop that competency. So you just heard one interesting example of religious illiteracy. Let me share another one here. This was in the news last year. In a school in Virginia, a middle school teacher was teaching her students about the history of Arab empires. And she gave them this exercise, always good to get kids involved in the learning, right? Don't just lecture at them, give them something interesting to do. And so she was teaching about the beauty of Arabic calligraphy and how important it is in the culture. And so she gave them this exercise to copy, to try their hand at reproducing some Arabic calligraphy. And there it is. This is the actual handout that the students worked with. I'm not going to play the video here, but this did not go well. Can you imagine why? What do you think might have happened? They thought she was teaching kids to be Muslim. In fact, the statement she had them copying, I don't know who designed this lesson plan, but it was not good. The statement she had them copying was actually the declaration of faith that makes one a Muslim. Probably not the best lesson design ever. Well-intentioned, no doubt. She got in big trouble. There was an uproar and threats, and in reaction to those threats, the school had to close for several days. This is crazy, as coming out of a basic problem of religious illiteracy. So what could have averted that? If the teacher had understood the significance of the Arabic text that she was asking them to copy, that would have helped. If the community members had understood better what the secular, non-faith-based teaching of religion in public schools is and is allowed to be, if they understood the importance of learning about these cultures and weren't defensive and fearful, right? All of these things could have prevented a pretty unfortunate situation. And situations like this are happening all the time. So, when we speak of religious literacy, I want to invite you to think of it in terms of language literacy. So we know that a person who is illiterate is going to have trouble functioning as an adult in our society, right? So what does it mean just to be literate in terms of language? What does it mean you can do? You can read and write. Does it mean you can write spectacularly powerful symbolic poetry in the language? No, it means you can read and write. You can fill out an application, you can read a menu, you can find the bathroom, you're literate. I want to argue for that level of fluency in understanding world religions. You don't need a PhD. You don't have to write the poetry. But if you could develop this basic level of literate competency, all of us will be better off the more of us have that competency. So here's how I'm going to define multi-religious literacy. 3 domains. And again, I'm going to keep drawing the parallel with language literacy. You need a basic knowledge base. You need to know that Islam is a monotheistic religion, just like Judaism and Christianity. You need to know that not all Buddhists believe in a God. You need to know some basic historical facts about when these traditions emerge, etc. So knowledge of the basic facts about religious beliefs and practices, but also, and this is something that the current field of religious studies is taking more and more seriously, awareness of the internal diversity of religions and how they change over time. Most religious studies programs that were born, for the most part, in this country in the 1960s and 70s, it's not an old discipline. Well, to you that's old. To me that's not old. Most of them are built on what we call the Big Five model. You got a course in Christianity, a course in Judaism, a course in Islam, a course in Buddhism, and a course in Hinduism. And then maybe you have a course on scripture, and maybe you have some courses on religion and contemporary issues. That's a pretty typical world religions program. But what we've discovered is there isn't one Christianity. There isn't one Judaism. There are countless varieties of these things, right? So we've got to pay attention to the internal diversity, the cultural diversity. Islam in Indonesia is very different from Islam in Saudi Arabia or in Sacramento, California, right? These religions are internally very, very diverse. We also, of course, need to understand something about the role of religion in the wider culture. But we also need some skills. And this is new, I think, in the study of religion. The study of religion has tended to be a pretty ivory tower field. We read our books, we study, we think, we compare, we write dissertations. But now we're realizing, wait a minute, this is a skill that people need in ordinary public life. They need to be able to use this information effectively. So I would break this down into the ability to interact effectively with those who are religiously different. When you walk by that guy saying his noontime prayers, do you call the police? Maybe not. Maybe instead you have a friendly engagement, right? Preferably after he's done with his prayers. And also the ability to exercise civic agency. This is a word that's very popular on our campus. We do a lot of work around civic engagement as a learning strategy. What does it mean to be a civic agent? When we talk about civics, what are we talking about? Involvement in the government, involvement in the community, making things happen in your community around issues of public interest, dealing with the issue of homelessness, changing laws around guns, changing the public school policy, right? These are all issues of civics. If you are multi-religiously literate, you are going to be much more civically effective in those issues that are important to you. And finally, there's an attitudinal quality to being multi-religiously literate. This one is maybe the most subtle and hard to pin down. So I will just say that some of the things I look for in someone who has made a reasonable study of religions is that they have a curiosity, a respect, and appreciation of diverse religious worldviews. Got to say instantly, same breath, that does not mean you believe all religions are true. That's a hard cut to make, right? I'm going to treat you with curiosity because you are a human on the planet dealing with some of the same stuff I am. I'm going to treat you with respect because you're my colleague in this endeavor of being on this planet. I'm going to appreciate what is important to you about your tradition. But at the same time, I get to maintain commitment to my own worldview. So this is a tricky dance. And I think it's an attitude that comes with time. And my career has been, my research area has been in interreligious relations. And one of the most fascinating things I've learned in 25 years of doing this study of what happens when people who are religiously different encounter one another, they don't convert each other. That's a very rare outcome. The most common outcome is they come to appreciate their own tradition in a new way. I went away to college in 1980 as a Roman Catholic and lived in a suite with 3 other young women, all of whom were Jewish. I was so jealous of how awesome Judaism seemed to me that freshman year. Because like Catholicism, yeah, I know all about that. But they went to services, they had these really cool rituals I didn't know anything about. So what did I do, become a Jew? No. I went back and tried to learn more about Catholicism. Do we have these cool things? Oh, wow, we actually do, right? And so I learned more about my own tradition in that conversation. And that seems to be the more common outcome. So what are we even talking about when we talk about religion? A lot of stuff. In this culture, I think we tend to focus on this first level, worldviews and belief systems. We tend to think religion equals, do you believe in God? What do you think happens when you die? Right, the big cosmic questions. In fact, those of us who have tried to define religion over the course of the history of this discipline have found that it's a lot more than that. Because it's tangled up with ethical and moral systems. What's the right thing to do? What should we value? What should we prioritize? Also, our cultural norms and traditions. For many people, their religious tradition is really only meaningful to them in the context of the foods that it's associated with, right? I'm an active Jew on Passover because I like that Seder meal and that ritual. But the rest of the year, not so much. So, there are layers to religious identity and how invested people are in the various layers of it. Social institutions, the Mormon Church, the Catholic Church, the Southern Baptist Convention. There are these religious institutions that are also powerful drivers of our culture that weigh in on political matters and shape policy, et cetera. But many people operate completely ignorant of what those institutions, that maybe the institution of their religion, are actually up to. Ritual practices, again, coming out of my Catholic tradition, many of us would say, oh, I don't believe in a lot of the stuff the church teaches, but I love the rituals. I love the incense and the bell ringing and the processing and the crucifix and the rosary. So these might not all line up neatly in a given person's life or across a religious tradition. So some varieties of Christianity would put more emphasis on ethical moral systems, some would put more emphasis on belief systems, some, like Orthodox and Roman Catholic Christianity, would put more emphasis on ritual practices. But at the bottom, people have spiritual experiences inside religious organizations and outside them. Sometimes on a hike, on a mountain path. That's a spiritual experience for people. So there's organized religion and there's unorganized spirituality. And one phrase that those of us in this field hear over and over again is, oh, I'm not really religious, but I'm very spiritual. This is a very common, California in particular, identity. We would say, that's great, but that's a kind of religion, because it involves all of these things. So please don't fall under the illusion that if it doesn't involve a formalized social institution with a leader and a doctrine and a scripture, that it's not religious. I swear to God, my husband belongs to the Church of Giants Baseball because it has all kinds of cultural traditions, ritual practices, right? Okay. So I'm going to try to break out those three areas: knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values, with just dipping a toe into what it might look like to become literate in those fields. So the first level of knowledge in becoming multi-religiously literate is just understanding that there are some different families of religiousness that have developed over time. Maybe being able to put them in rough chronological order of how they emerged in our human history. Maybe understanding that they have some things in common. For instance, Jews, Christians, and Muslims are all Abrahamic. They all trace their origin to the patriarch Abraham, who figures in both the Quran and the Hebrew Bible, which becomes the Old Testament of the Christian scriptures, right? They're all monotheists. They share many of the same stories, scriptural stories, etc. The Indian traditions, many of us have an image of the Buddha as a sort of round East Asian, maybe Chinese-looking fellow, but in fact, the Buddha was a real historical figure who lived and died in India, growing out of the earlier Hindu tradition. So there are these families. So ideas of karma and reincarnation permeate those traditions. And then the Chinese traditions of the Confucianists and the Taoists add their own unique perspective to, again, what it means to be a human and live in this mortal time period. What insights have these different groups had about these experiences? And then, of course, the problem with any effort to diagram anything is that you end up with the other category, which is a terrible label to put on anybody. But these little green circles are, sadly, I apologize, there to represent all the indigenous traditions and the independent new religious movements that don't neatly align with part of them. So a world religions class would spend a semester sorting some of that out. Is that right? Is that what you do in a world religions class? Some timelines, some common beliefs, some varieties. But again, more and more, we're trying to pay attention to the internal diversity, change over time, change over culture, and the present variety existing in any one of these religious traditions. But let's bring the knowledge base a little closer to home, and here's where Diana Eck is helpful to us. What do we know about US religious diversity? It's a quiz. You have to answer. What % of Americans identify as some variety of Christian? And we're using the sociological category of Christianity. This is a tricky one. This is a really, this is an important principle of religious studies. People get to self-define. So if I say I'm a Christian, we count you as a Christian. There's no judge saying, you don't believe this exactly, so we're not going to count you in the Christian world. People get to self-define. There are some groups of Christians that would say that neither Catholics nor Mormons are Christian. That's a theological position. That's not a sociological analysis of the self-reporting of people's religious identity. So, of all those folks who identify as some kind of Christian, what % of Americans? Give me a number.
65.
Nice. 70. You all are so smart. It's right around 70, probably a little lower now. I made that slide a year ago. It's probably in the high 60s now at this point. And again, it depends what study do you look at. And okay. But in California, considerably lower. Okay, so what % are religiously unaffiliated? Now again, this could be the spiritual but not religious folks. It could be the militantly atheist, anti-religion folks. They're all in this none of the above category. What number would you give them? Yep, a little higher now actually, maybe 21, 22. But again, higher in California. Somebody should study this. Why are Californians less religious than people in the rest of the world? Wouldn't that be an interesting sociological thing to investigate? That's what religious studies does. And among young people, even higher. So we're seeing a demographic trend of attrition from religious affiliation among younger people. The remaining 10% then is made up of Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, and other minority religious groups, which seems really small, but these groups are growing quickly. Whereas the Christian populations are kind of leveling off, declining. But as I said earlier, the biggest winners in this shift seem right now to be the religiously unaffiliated. Again, higher in California, those minority religious groups higher in California. And this is my favorite statistic. Right now, 16% of Americans identify with more than one religious tradition. So that's a new way of being religious. So if Eck's writing about a new religious America, that's one of the new things when people are multi-religious in and of their own person. We're not quite sure what that means yet, but that's a really interesting area of research. A couple more fun facts. 1993 is the last year that white Protestants were a majority in the United States, and there are some theorists working right now on the idea that this fact may be a contributor to our current political situation, right? Where this loss among white Protestants of what had formerly been a very dominant position in the culture might contribute to a kind of anger and anxiety about what's happening to my country. So that's another interesting area of research. Protestants as a whole, as of 2012, are no longer a majority in our country, although I think one could argue that Protestant influence remains very, very strong. In California, there are as many Buddhists as Lutherans. Lutherans, one of the largest Protestant denominations. And there's that fact again, 1 out of 6 Americans now follow more than one set of religious practices. So that's just some basic factual knowledge that begins to, I hope, prompt some reflection on what it means to be religious, what it means to be American, and what it means to be in a religiously diverse society. That's the springboard for the kind of research that goes on in the field of religious studies. But now this second tier, the skills base, I'll just say a little bit about as well. And let's start with interpersonal skills. Regardless of what career you end up in, regardless of your own religious identity, I think most of us would agree it's useful to be able to have civil conversation with folks. So, what's the biggest obstacle to having a conversation with someone who is religiously different? Just at the interpersonal roommate kind of level. Friend's new partner that you're meeting for the first time. Like, what's the obstacle to good, civil, meaningful conversation with someone who is religiously other?
Maybe one would feel like they're betraying their beliefs by interacting.
Right. Right. I'm compromising my own faith if I sort of get all warm and fuzzy with you and your other way of seeing the world.
They're on the make, trying to convert.
Yes, right. I'm going to get into this ugly thing where you're trying to convert me and I have to push that away. And right, anxiety about conversion. Yeah, and I think one reason many of us fear rejection in these interactions is, I'm afraid I'm going to offend you. I think most of our failure to engage in these good conversations comes from fear. Not fear that you're going to kill me, fear that you're going to think I'm an idiot, or fear that you're going to think I'm mean because I asked you about that turban you're wearing and I don't really know what it means, and is it really, am I allowed to even ask you about that? We get very uncomfortable about these things. So again, a little knowledge, a little literacy goes a long way in developing these interpersonal skills. I think the problem of stereotyping is probably the biggest way this surfaces. So if I asked you to reflect on this based on your own identity, and we had a whole panel at Chico State on this. We've done it multiple times. We get a panel of 6 or 8 students representing different religious identities and non-religious identities. And we ask them all to start by giving a 2-minute, what I think you don't get about my religion or my lack of religion. So anybody have willingness to share on this as a blank? I think people don't understand blank. I know, be brave.
So I'm a Tibetan Buddhist, and I get some really interesting things, right, that people think they know. So one of them would be that people think that, like, Buddhism is just this, like, super friendly, everyone's kind, and you can make it up as you go along.
Yes, and you have beautiful Zen gardens everywhere.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, in Tibetan Buddhism is super different than that, and it's one
Right.
of those like regimented,
Right.
rule-following, there are hells kind of tradition
Right.
out there, and we always get people who like sort of freak out, to be
Yeah.
honest, when they really sort of learn what Buddhism's about.
Right, that it's just as rigorous as, or more than, those religions that they think people become Buddhists to escape. Thank you. Others? Stereotypes that might exist about, and maybe not even your identity, but stereotypes that exist about religious or non-religious identities?
As someone who doesn't affiliate with one religion or another, a lot of people think that I don't believe in a higher power or that I don't believe in God, which is not really the case. It's just something that I don't necessarily affiliate with one specific religion, but I still do think there's certain aspects of religion that I do believe in.
Right, yeah. So that assumption that non-religious means no spiritual belief system at all. Or one I hear really often is non-religious means, how could you have a moral compass? How could you know what's right and wrong if you don't belong to a religion? I hear that all the time. Others, yeah.
My uncle and my aunt in Baptists in Georgia, they get really worried at the fact that once they find out that they're Baptists in Georgia, that they're automatically racist.
Right. Evangelical, conservative Christians are all racist or closed-minded, intolerant in any domain. Yeah. Another? Yes.
Good. Thank you.
Did everybody hear that one? If you, coming out of the Unitarian Universalist tradition, there's often a lot of support for the situation of Palestinians, and when those groups speak out on that issue, there's an automatic assumption that you are not just challenging the policies of the State of Israel, but that you are anti-Semitic. So there's a stereotype that comes attached with that. Yeah. Okay. So how do we challenge stereotypes? Well, whenever you hear them, you say, you know, is that really true? And you can just directly challenge them, but I think we cultivate a culture of de-stereotyping when we practice friendly curiosity, empathetic understanding, perspective taking, and civil dialogue. These are the kind of skills that we are now starting to work on more and more in the actual academic study of religion, which, as I said, used to be very textbooky. You learn the facts, you take the test, you write the paper, you think, wow, that was a really cool religion I just learned about. But now we're trying to take that to another level and actually cultivate some of these skills in our students. There's some interesting reasons why we didn't used to do that I've actually just written about. We were sort of, religious studies as a discipline has some kind of anxiety about being seen as like the chaplaincy, like the campus chaplains. No, we're academic. So we've always wanted to keep it super academics, cut and dried, learn the facts, just the facts. So there's been this hesitancy about getting into the cultivation of attitudes and skills, but I think we're finally getting past that and starting to do very good work in that area. So in addition to interpersonal skills, there are also those civic skills. Remember, becoming an effective person in your community, able to lead conversations about difficult issues forward. So here's a little case study from our Central Valley. Should a 7th grade Sikh student who wears a kirpan or a ceremonial dagger be suspended from school for violating the no weapons policy? I don't want you to answer that yes or no. I want you to tell me, what would you need to know more about? What literacy would you need to be able to make a judgment here?
Is it sharp?
Is it sharp? What is the kirpan? I'd want to know a little more about that. What else would you need to know?
What role does it play in the religion? Is it something they would need with them at school to exercise?
Is it important to have it on them at all times? Is that part of the practice? Or is it just a little accessory that this 7th grader thought was kind of cool? Yeah.
Is this a common everyday occurrence, or is this for special purpose?
Thank you. Yeah.
What does the religion, or does it even mention, like violence?
Good. Great. Bigger picture. What's the teaching about violence and nonviolence in the religion? Great. Okay. So again, the literacy helps with the civic skill of being an appropriate contributor in your community. So how would what tools would you need to exercise that civic skill? You would need to understand something about the law. What does the law say about the freedom of a Sikh to practice his religion in a public school? So we would need to understand the very basic constitutional framework of the First Amendment. And this is what it says. This is the primary constitutional language about religion. And this is what court cases come back to again and again and again. First of all, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust. You can't run for Senate if you're not a Protestant Christian. Yeah, that's not allowed. There's no religious test. Okay, so that's the one. But then this is where we get into the regulation of the practice of religion. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. That is not surprisingly called the Establishment Clause. And then the second one, so Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This one's called the Free Exercise Clause. Okay, so what does the Establishment Clause mean? Plain person's language. What can't we do? We will not have a state religion. And more than that, it's mostly about money. We will not give money, our tax money, our collective pot of money, shall not privilege one religion over another, because that's moving toward having an established religion. So we got to have a level playing field. So, okay, we're not going to elevate one tradition over another. We're also not going to penalize one over another, right? We're going to treat them even-handedly. But at the same time, so we're not going to fund your mosque or your church, but we're also not going to prohibit the free exercise of your religion. You get to do what you want. Okay, 7th grade Sikh student, what does that mean? You get to carry your kirpan, right?
Depends. So I'm a political scientist. So it will depend on whether that action prohibits the school from, the school's your parent. So K through 12 public setting,
Exactly.
It has the right to prevent sort of like public safety or disruption in the classroom, right? They can have dress codes, they can search your locker, right? Anything that kind of might,
Threaten the well-being.
Yeah, so they might be able to say you can't wear it.
Right. So the big principle is freedom of religion. And the way the courts have sliced this is freedom of belief, absolute. You believe whatever the heck you want. Freedom of practice, mostly. But we're going to have to regulate that in some circumstances. And this is what the courts tend to look for. It has to be a sincerely held religious belief. So again, is that kirpan thing really, is that a big deal for Sikhs, or is that just something, that this child wanted to do? The individual or group has to show that their religion would be substantially burdened. It would be a big deal to a Sikh not to be able to carry the kirpan to school. and the state has to demonstrate a compelling interest. What would the state's interest in that case be? Safety. That's a pretty big one, right? They're protecting the children in the school. Okay, so looking at that, do you know how it came out? Do you know this case? About 10 years old. It was actually a family of children. It is a very important requirement of the Sikh religion. The kirpan is about this big, and they were permitted to carry it so long as, first of all, it was like a butter knife, not a super sharp thing, and they could carry it if it were stitched into a little sheath, little holster kind of thing. So that was the compromise they worked out. Safety protected, but they did show, or the court believed they showed, that it was sincere and it was significant. It would have been a religious burden to them not to. So this is what civics is. There's no black and white. You have to work it out in each instance, but the more literate you are, the more knowledge and skills you have, the more effective you will be in guiding these decisions in the right way and heading off very ugly, violent things that happen in the absence of that literacy. Finally, attitudes and values. And I'm thinking of this. I was talking to my daughter last night. I said, I'm trying to draw these analogies that the skills are like the grammar, you know, the rules of how you use the vocabulary. This is the building blocks. This is how you use it. I said, what would the attitudes or values be? And she says, duh, pronunciation. It's like how you express it, right? So here I'm talking again about that curiosity and respect. What do we do to cultivate that? I think we have to get past this idea of tolerance, which carried us through most of the 20th century. We talked about being a tolerant society. Well, that's great, but that means I sort of put up with you. That doesn't get you that far. How could we go a step further to actually understand that we are all in this together, whether we are students on this campus, whether we are citizens of a city or of a country, ultimately of a global community. We are in this together, and your thriving depends on my thriving. So we had better figure out a way to understand how to hold our own identity while maintaining a kind of respectful openness and engagement with the other. Ibu Patel is one of my current intellectual heroes. He founded an organization in Chicago called the Interfaith Youth Corps, and he was an advisor to President Obama's faith-based initiatives program. And I think this is what it's about: to see the other side, to defend another people, not despite your tradition, but because of it, is the heart of pluralism. So to find in your own religious tradition that value that says the other can be okay. Where do we have that value of inclusion and tolerance and respect, and beyond respect to care for the stranger, the other? That's in every religion I've ever studied. So can we elevate those aspects of the tradition to move beyond tolerance? So finally, I'm wrapping up now. If nothing else, if this topic bores you to tears, I can help you with that. It's my passion. It's not yours. You got your own thing. That's great. But please be aware that this is a professional competency that more and more work sites will depend on. And I just came up with a handful right off the top of my head. A nurse caring for a dying Hindu patient in a hospital should know what the death rituals are in the Hindu community to best care for that person and their family. A manager of a factory needing to build a schedule around Muslim prayer times because 80% of his workforce are Somali immigrants. That's a challenge. How are you going to do that? Because they have religious freedom rights, right? So your literacy there is going to be a critical professional skill. A journalist covering legislation on transgender bathroom access, which many religious groups have weighed in on. Oh, what do these religions teach? And what is that based in? And what is the biblical foundation of that? It'd be useful to know. A police officer responding to a complaint about a Hmong family sacrificing a chicken. It happens. What do? They need to understand, again, is it important to the religion? Is there a way to work within the religious practice to accommodate it to the norms and standards of the community? These are professional skills that are increasingly urgent in our culture. Again, as Eck says, as we are coming into interaction with one another, like it or not. Okay, final quote here. If I went back to college today, I think I would probably major in comparative religion. Yes. Because that's how integrated it is in everything that we are working on and deciding and thinking about in life today. So I haven't even touched on global issues of global terrorism and how is the global Muslim community responding to the radicalization of members of its fold, and how best do non-Muslims engage and support that conversation. Right? It's a huge issue, probably the issue of our time internationally. And so you can take it from a Secretary of State. So this is the last case I want to mention. This happened, not this past summer, but the one before. This was a guy at a Best Western, I think, hotel in Ohio, and he was in the lobby making a call on his cell phone, and the receptionist at the hotel heard him speaking in Arabic and thought maybe he was a terrorist, so she called 911, and the police came and put him in handcuffs and took him away. And it took a while to clarify that this was a fairly high-powered businessman, maybe not that high-powered, he was at a Best Western, I don't know. But this was a legitimate a transaction, a phone call he was making, had absolutely nothing to do with religion, terror, or anything else. And it caused a rift, right? The US had to make a formal apology to another nation. Big deal. What knowledge, skills, and attitudes might have helped here?
The police were not as prepared. They should have been asking some key questions, and they didn't, and that led to that incident. I'm really appalled by that.
That's right. So the clerk, the employee, maybe should have understood that, first of all, just because you dress like this doesn't make you a Muslim. Arab doesn't equal Muslim. And just because you're a Muslim, don't make you a terrorist. You'd think we'd be there by now, but we're not. Right, so literacy on her part, much better practices on the part of law enforcement should have been in place. Skills, what kind of skills could have been used here?
I don't know if it's more like knowledge, but like knowing that somebody speaking a different language, in this case Arabic, like does not necessarily mean they're plotting a terrorist attack.
Thank you.
I mean, I speak Arabic, and like I'm getting looks on people, like they see me talking, and they're like I don't really have the heart to do anything, so nothing bad ever happens, but I get looks, and I'm like, like it's America, like we have people that are bilingual or even trilingual. So.
Right. You know, I should have listed on skills. Having many languages is a great multi-religious literate skill, knowing a couple extra languages. We're on a big debate on our campus now about whether to require a foreign language or not. Other skills or attitudes that would have helped here? De-escalation skills, friendly curiosity practice might have helped on her part. Oh, I heard you speaking another language that I don't understand. Where are you from? Oh, that sounds interesting. Tell me more about that.
I just, some cultures just have a culture of hospitality, and we sadly seem to be lacking that in this country a lot.
That's a really interesting observation. I love that word hospitality because it's a deeply theological word. If you were to study the sacred texts of I know Western religions better than I know Eastern religions, but Judaism, Christianity, Islam, it's a theme that runs like a river through all of them, this theme of hospitality to the stranger. So again, that gets to Patel's statement about let's look into our own traditions for the principles that will allow us to act more inclusively.
I want to go back to that slide about the 70% identified Christian. We want to share the famous story of the congressman from Michigan or Minnesota, the African-American Muslim, who took his oath of office on the Quran.
Yeah.
It went viral with very negative.
Right.
How would you place that in your thoughts? Have the students heard that story?
Yeah, well, I think they just did. You want to say it again?
Tremendous pushback from a congressman who took his oath of office on the Quran. And everyone else uses the Bible. And they did a study. No one's ever done that before. Yeah. Except for a senator from Utah used the Book of Mormon and the Bible in one edition.
Yeah.
cover the bases.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Thoughts?
So to me, that just shows the hypocrisy of America. There's supposed to be no religious test, but yet why is your hand still on the, Bible? And what does it matter if there's no religious test?
And why do we pledge allegiance to a flag under God, right? These have been litigated, and the argument is typically that it's tradition and it's not enforcing any sort of test. But I think here's a great case where somebody actually tests it. Is it just a tradition? Oh, okay, then I'm actually going to use my own scripture. Well, wait a minute. Then there's pushback, right? And I think this speaks to that fact of the loss of dominance of white Protestant America, because I think it's very important that it was an African American congressman. I don't think it's just that he was a Muslim. I think there's a great deal of anxiety about our changing demographics and the loss of hegemony, the loss of dominance of some groups, and not knowing where they're going to find their footing. So it all looks very scary. Yeah.
I believe it was Thomas Jefferson's Quran that was used in the story.
Yeah, it was.
Is that right? Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah. Quite a religiously literate guy. Yeah. Okay, now my sales pitch. We are doing mighty things at Chico State. We're a small department, but we are changing quickly, and we are building very exciting programs, I think. So last year, we launched a completely redesigned religious studies major. We broke out of that Big Five model, and we are now teaching courses like Religious Life and the Professions. We are teaching courses like Religion, Sex, and Gender, Religion and the Natural World. So we are trying to reframe the study of religion in a way that makes sense for the world we live in now. Now we have taken that degree and put it completely online. So for people who have completed their 60 units of general education and whatnot, done their, ready to transfer, you can completely do the religious studies degree and all the upper division general education requirements at Chico State in an online degree completion program. And what's super cool about it is the lectures are delivered live in a classroom like this, although smaller, and you log in remotely and you can see the lectures and participate in the lectures as they're happening, or go to the archived lecture and participate asynchronously. So you have that option, because we still have the on-campus students participating in the same class. And just this fall, we launched also a new certificate in interreligious and intercultural relations for non-religious studies majors or minors. This is for people who want to be journalists, who want to be healthcare workers, who want to be teachers, who want to be, who are criminal justice majors, wanting to go into law enforcement, to develop these additional competencies. So we give them basic world religions information in some intro classes, and then we give them intercultural communication classes and courses specific to diversity in their professional field. So all kinds of opportunities that I would love to talk more with you about as you think about what might be coming next for you. I brought a couple of flyers that landed in the back, okay, on our new programs. One last thing I'll say, and then I'll take your question. I was just shown this article in your newspaper that ARC opens a new meditation room. Brilliant act of multi-religious literacy, because it sounds, from the pull-out quote here, I haven't read the article, we got the conversations going about how we can have a safe space for Muslims to be on campus, but I notice it's not called a Muslim prayer room. It's called a meditation room. Why? No establishment, right? It's a religiously neutral space that accommodates multiple religious and non-religious purposes, because non-religious folks meditate too. Okay. Any other questions I can answer for you? Yes, sir.
There's some things I've taught history for over 20 years, and I'm very much aware of apocalyptic movements and how religion can be weaponized, and quite literally millions of people can die in the process of this. And this has always been one of my big concerns in teaching. Also the correlation with genocide and religion as well too. How are you trying to address these things? Because I feel like, especially now that with a lot of really strange things like the alt-right now embracing the Kali Yuga Hinduism idea that goes back to wacko Nazism, religious theories. I think there needs to be a real serious literacy in apocalypticism.
This is a really interesting point, and I want to respond to it on two levels. There is a great deal of religious studies work that goes on around apocalyptic movements. We have a course called The End of the World, Religious Studies 3 whatever, The End of the World, and it's all these different religious visions of how it all goes down, and its effect on social movements, et cetera. So on the one hand, it is something that we need to study and understand. But there's another point that I think is very tricky that we have not figured out yet, and that is we want to be cultivating this openness, inclusive, dialogical perspective on world religions, and that can make us not want to look at the dark sides, right? We can't do that. To be religiously neutral, as academic study of religion programs must be, is not only to give fair treatment to all the different religious and non-religious worldviews, but also to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that, I think, religious studies as a discipline is very good at, because as I said, we were born out of this "we are not the theology department" movement, right? We are neutral. And so the critical study of these traditions and the atrocities that members of these traditions and even institutions of religion have wrought in history has to be a part of the curriculum. But in fact, I think it also gives credibility to the argument for inclusiveness and engagement, because it says we take seriously how complicated these things are. We're not just putting a rosy face on everything. And I've gone 2 minutes over. I'm sorry. Sorry.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
Since we're also familiar with the work of Diane Moore,
Mm-hmm.
Diane Moore, someone who kind of continues some of these conversations, another scholar, and part of her definition of being religiously literate is recognizing the social, cultural, and political dimensions of religion.
Right.
A lot of times when we talk about religion, we automatically think that excludes discussions of culture and politics, right? And so part of developing religious literacy is being aware of the cultural and social factors that are also in play with religious identity.
Yeah.
And then when we start talking about any kinds of acts of terror or anything like that, there's always these aspects of what's happening culturally, contextually, economically, politically, in terms of the military, and having awareness of that social context is a part of increasing your religious literacy.
Yeah, part of our program, required course in our new degree program is Religion, Politics, and Conflict that looks at just those issues.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you.